In Chapter 9, we're going to look at the concept of authentic leadership. Now, when you read this chapter, you might find that it seems a little bit more confused and unclear compared to the other chapters. And if that's your case, you are not alone. I find it that way too, and I think most people do. Authentic leadership's not as developed and clear as some of the other theories are, and we'll talk about that, especially near the end. But what can we say about authentic leadership? First of all, authentic leadership focuses on whether or not leadership is genuine or real. That's what authentic means. Now, it's not super sure what that means specifically in a leadership context, and we'll look and see that there's different versions of this. But this interest in authentic leadership has increased in the last couple of decades due to unethical behaviors of politicians and businesses, and just large-scale deception that has occurred, and losses of billions of dollars, and a lot of shameful behavior that political leaders have done. And in response, people claim they want trustworthy leaders. Now, I'm not sure that that's true. I think people generally want leaders that share their values, and if that leader doesn't share their value, they'll claim that the other person is unethical. And to some degree, people want trustworthy leaders, but I don't see people changing their voting habits very easily, at least in terms of politics. Now, there are a number of versions of authentic leadership. The intrapersonal perspective, looking at the inside, interpersonal perspective, looking at relationships, this practical perspective by Bill George that calls a lot of practical tips authentic leadership, and then the developmental perspective, which is the main one in the textbook, and that's what we'll focus the most time on. But let's look at the other versions of authentic leadership, which really don't have a whole lot to do with each other than emphasizing the idea of being authentic. So first off, let's start with the intrapersonal authentic leadership. So intrapersonal means within yourself. So it's leadership based on one's self-concept and how one's self-concept relates to one's actions. So your self-concept depends on your own history, the story of the leader, what sometimes is called the critical life events. What made you be what you are, and out of how you were raised, out of the experiences that you went through, out of the choices that you've made, you have this self-concept of who you are and what you believe in. And so authentic leadership in this sense is acting from these convictions. So authentic leaders lead from their own convictions. They don't do things because other people say that this is what you should do. And so authentic leaders are original. They don't copy what others do. They just do what they think is right. So that's the intrapersonal authentic leadership. In contrast, there's the interpersonal authentic leadership, where this is Alice Eagly's theory, is that where leadership is created by leaders and followers together, and it focuses on being relationally authentic, communicating clearly in a trustworthy way. And this leadership's a reciprocal process because leaders affect followers and followers affect leaders. So that's the interpersonal approach to authentic leadership. And then a very popular approach to authentic leadership is what the textbook calls the practical approach to authentic leadership. And it's developed by Bill George, who's a popular business writer. And he says there's 5 characteristics of authentic leaders. They have a sense of purpose in their life. They know what they're supposed to be accomplishing. They have strong values, and they know what they believe is right and wrong and what's important in life. They're sure of themselves. They have trusting relationships with others. They've been able to develop these healthy relationships with people throughout their life and in their work situation. They act upon these values, and these values are what direct them in their leadership. And they're sensitive to others, what other people are thinking and feeling, and they take other people into consideration. Now, without a doubt, this is good practical advice, whether it's actual leadership, and if that leadership is beneficial to an organization, another question. But it's good practical advice in life if you want to have a good life. So that's why that's called the practical approach to authentic leadership by Bill George. Now, the textbook focuses on more of a developmental approach to authentic leadership. That's the focus of this chapter, and it's been developed by Wallumbwa and colleagues, and we'll have more to say about him near the end. And here's a definition: a pattern that draws upon and promotes both positive psychological capacities and a positive ethical climate to foster greater self-awareness, an internalized moral perspective, balanced processing of information, and relational transparency on the part of leaders working with followers, fostering positive self-development. Now, you might think that definition is not very clear. That's kind of how I think about it too. So let's look at it in detail. So we're going to start off with factors from which authentic leadership is developed. So this is the basis of authentic leadership. And then these are also things that authentic leadership promotes. So they're both antecedents and consequences, causes and effects of authentic leadership in this in this framework. And there's two big categories, according to the definitions. There's what's known as positive psychological capacities. And that means just being healthy psychologically. Authentic leadership comes from being healthy psychologically, and it promotes psychological health. And this psychological health is characterized by confidence in life, hope that things are going to get better, optimism that things are going to work out, and this resilience of being able to do well even when things don't go well. So that's what's characterized as positive psychological capacities, when people are able to demonstrate these things in their lives. Now, the second base and the second thing that authentic leadership promotes is a positive ethical climate, or sometimes it's said moral reasoning capacities. And this is the idea to be able to decide between right and wrong. This idea of promoting justice, the greater good of the organization, the community. So in this approach to authentic leadership, we look at psychological stability, psychological health, and this ability to have strong moral values. So in this basic model of authentic leadership, there's 4 components or 4 purposes. It's not clear if this is what authentic leadership is composed of or what authentic leadership is supposed to produce. Maybe both. The first is self-awareness. That means being aware of what's happening in oneself, reflecting on one's core values, identities, emotions, motives. It's like really knowing what's going on inside one's head and one's heart. And then there's this idea of an internalized moral perspective. That's the idea that, oh, I know what's right and wrong, and I use those principles to guide my behavior. So that's an internalized moral perspective. The third thing is balanced process, which means the idea to be able to use information objectively, not get overwhelmed by one's feelings or desires, but to look at the information I have objectively and to listen to other people, get their opinions, and take them into consideration before making a decision. And then the fourth element is relational transparency. And that's like the interpersonal aspect of authentic leadership, being open and honest and presenting one's true self to others. So those are the 4 components of authentic leadership, or the 4 purposes of authentic leadership in this model. Now let's talk about some of the strengths and the weaknesses of authentic leadership. When we talk about authentic leadership, it responds to society's needs to trustworthy leadership. People want trustworthy leadership, so if we talk about authentic leadership or convince people that we're authentic, that makes people happy. It fills a void in an uncertain world. Secondly, when you look at approaches like Bill George, it provides broad guidelines for those who want to become better people and who have a better life. There's no doubt that Bill George has a lot of wisdom in his suggestions for being an authentic leader. Like transformational leadership, and later we'll see servant leadership, authentic leadership has an explicit moral dimension, and it emphasizes what's right and wrong, where other versions of leadership don't especially pay attention to what's right and wrong. So some versions have a focus on the collective good, what's good for everybody. Others just like, okay, what are your own personal values, and that's what counts. You need to act on those. And unlike traits that only some people exhibit, like the charismatic transformational leader that transforms the people around them, everyone can learn to become more authentic and develop some of these strengths that are promoted. Now, there's some criticisms of authentic leadership. First of all, the theory is still in the formative stages, so some concepts are not clear or substantiated with data. And it's just like, oh, this is nice thinking, but how does it actually affect organizations? What does it really mean to be authentic? Why are these different ideas associated with each other? So things really aren't too clear with a lot of authentic leadership definitions. Secondly, it's difficult for people to distinguish between authentic leadership and narcissism. Narcissism is this idea of being really centered on oneself and loving oneself and thinking that you're really great and therefore you have the right to influence and dominate other people. Leaders high in narcissism will do all they can to convince themselves and their followers that they're authentic. And a lot of times they do a really good job of it. But really, it's just self-centered narcissism that's leading them, and if they can convince people that they're being authentic, people will tend to believe that they're being authentic, and it's hard to distinguish between the two. Now, a good example of this is the story of Greg Mortensen in the textbook. In the 7th edition of this textbook, Greg Mortensen was portrayed as an authentic leader because he raised all kinds of money to develop schools for poor people and just like came across as being super sincere and this wonderful person. And shortly after the 7th edition of the textbook came out, it all exploded. It turned out he was just a fake and that he really hadn't done the things that he had said he had done. And he's an example of someone who was pretty inauthentic. And that's what happens whenever I see somebody that's really concerned about trying to convince people how authentic they are, I'm a little skeptical. I want to see the proof of what they're of how they're actually living. Now, a third issue, especially in this this developmental approach to authentic leadership that the textbook focuses on, the rationale for including these positive psychological capacities as part of authentic leadership is not clear. It seems kind of as if random concepts are just kind of stuck together. And that's because authenticity is not really well defined in most contexts. a good question to pose, and a lot of people pose this question, should we just be studying the trait of honesty instead? Do we want authentic leaders, whatever that means, or do we want honest leaders who say things that correspond to the truth, to reality? I'm of the personal opinion that honesty is far more important. That's really the root of things, and it's a lot more clear what honesty is compared to authenticity. Or is authentic leadership, such as the Bill George variety, essentially emotional intelligence and purpose in life? These things that are really important to have a good life and to have a good relationship. Things just aren't very clear by what we mean when we talk about authentic leadership. Now, another issue that is a super major issue is that one of the researchers of authentic leadership, in fact, the main researcher of authentic leadership, Fred Wallumbwa, has had many of the papers that he published on authentic leadership retracted. What does that mean? That means the editors found evidence that what he was saying wasn't really honest, that he was making up the data that he presented in the data. Now, officially, they retracted them because he couldn't provide the data upon which these studies were based. And he said, oh yeah, he's looking for it, and he was sure that he was going to find it, but he just couldn't find it at the time. But because he never found it, the editor said, okay, these articles, we're retracting them. We don't think that they were really based on the data that they were said they were based on. And that is kind of, I would not trust somebody trying to talk about authentic leadership who is making up their data. So this whole field of authentic leadership is somewhat in a crisis because things aren't clear. There's an awful lot of inauthenticity and hypocrisy going on, and we can expect to see a lot of evolution in thought concerning authentic leadership in the years ahead. Now, as you probably know, I like ending my videos with a short biblical reflection because of my own personal convictions as a Christian, as someone who wants to follow Jesus Christ. One of the things that Jesus taught was that every tree is known by its fruit. Good trees produce good fruit, bad trees produce bad fruit. And the idea is, the way that we can tell if somebody's authentic and genuine or good and has good values is not by what they say, not how persuasive they are, but what they actually do in their life. The Apostle Paul talks about this also. He says, love must be sincere, the idea of being without hypocrisy. Hate what is evil, cling to what is good. That's the test. If somebody claims to be wanting to do something good, do they hate what is evil and stay away from that? Do they cling to what is good and value that? Be devoted to one another in love, being committed to doing the right things, to benefiting others. Honor others more than you do yourself. Treat others as if they're more important than yourself. That's the proof of someone having good moral values, is the way that they treat other people, the way that they respond to others, the way that they respond to God, the way that they humbly come before God and others when they are wrong, when they do make mistakes, and seek forgiveness, and then commit themselves to doing right from that point forward.